two or three of us were sitting around in the dining room Sunday morning having a late breakfast and talking over coffee. And suddenly we heard planes roaring overhead, and we said, "The flyboys are really busy at Ford Island this morning." The island was directly across the channel from the hospital. We didn't think too much about it since the reserves were often there for weekend training. We no sooner got those words out when we started to hear noises that were foreign to us. I leaped out of my chair and dashed to the nearest window in the corridor. Right then, there was a plane flying directly over the top of our quarters, a one-story structure. The rising sun under the wing of the plane denoted the enemy. Had I known the pilot, one could almost see his features around his goggles. He was obviously saving his ammunition for the ships. Just down the row, all the ships were sitting there, the California, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and others. My heart was racing, the telephone was ringing, the chief nurse, Gertrude Arnest, was saying, "Girls, get into your uniforms at once. This is the real thing." I was in my room by that time, changing into uniform. It was getting dusky, almost like evening. Smoke was rising from burning ships. I dashed across the street through a shrapnel shower, got into the lanai, and just stood still for a second, as were a couple of doctors. I felt like I were frozen to the ground, but it was only a split second. I ran to the orthopedic dressing room, but it was locked. A corpsman ran to the OD's desk for the keys. It seemed like an eternity before he returned and the room was opened. We drew water into every container we could find and set up the instrument boiler. Fortunately, we still had electricity and water. Dr. Brunson, the chief of medicine, was making sick call when the bombing started. When he was finished, he was to play golf, a phrase never to be uttered again. The first patient came into our dressing room at 8:25 a.m. with a large opening in his abdomen and bleeding profusely. They started an intravenous and transfusion. I can still see the tremor of Dr. Brunson's hand as he picked up the needle. Everyone was terrified. The patient died within the hour. Then the burned patient streamed in. The USS Nevada had managed some steam and attempted to get out of the channel. They were unable to make it and went aground on Hospital Point, right near the hospital. There was heavy oil on the water, and the men dived off the ship and swam through these waters to Hospital Point. Not too great a distance, but when one is burned, how they ever managed, I'll never know. The tropical dress at the time was white T-shirts and shorts. The burns began where the pants ended. Bared arms and faces were, plentiful. Personnel retrieved a supply of flit guns from stock, and we filled these with tannic acid to spray burned bodies. And then we gave these gravely injured patients sedatives for their intense pain. About 12 noon, the galley personnel came around with sandwiches and cold drinks. We ate on the run. About 2 o'clock, the chief nurse was making rounds to check on all the units and arrange relief schedules. I was relieved around 4 p.m. and went over to the nurses' quarters where everything was intact. I freshened up, had something to eat, and went back on duty at 8 p.m. I was scheduled to report to a surgical unit. By now it was dark, and we worked with flashlights. The maintenance people and anyone else who could manage a hammer and nails were putting up black drapes or black paper to seal the crevices against any light that might stream to the outside. About 10 or 11 o'clock, there were planes overhead. I really hadn't felt frightened until this particular time. My knees were knocking together, and the patients were calling, "Nurse, nurse." The other nurse and I went to them, held their hands a few moments, and then went on to others. The priest was a very busy man. The noise ended very quickly, and word got around that those were our own planes. I worked until midnight on that ward, and then was directed to go down to the basement level in the main hospital building and hear the dependents, the women and children, the families of the doctors and other staff officers were placed for the night. There were ample blankets and pillows. We lay body by body along the walls of the basement. The children were frightened and the adults tense. It was not a very restful night for anyone.